With determination, hard work, and perseverance, one can overcome obstacles and achieve success in life. An English chapter from Class 10, NCRT, A Triumph of Surgery, taken from the book Footprints Without Food, is a story that talks about how pampering animals can cause issues. It shows love between the pet and the pet owner. We often spoil our loved ones by showering too much love upon them. This story talks about the wealthy lady, Mrs. Pumphrey, who has a pet dog named Tricky. The title of the story is A Triumph of Surgery. Here, triumph means victory, and surgery, it is not operation, but it means healing. Surgery also means a place where patient is cured, that is, hospital or clinic. Now, who was ill? What type of surgery it was? And what type of victory they got? We are going to see in this video. Hello everyone, you're watching The Tutor. If you haven't subscribed the channel yet, make sure to subscribe it. Now, let's move on to the chapter. A Triumph of Surgery is written by James Alfred White, who was known by the pen name James Harriet. He was born on 3rd October 1916. He was a British veterinary surgeon and writer who used his years of experience to write a series of books consisting of stories about animals. He died on 23rd Feb 1995. Okay, so this was about the author. Now, that A Triumph of Surgery. Tricky, a small dog, is pampered and overfed by his rich mistress. He falls seriously ill and his mistress consults a veterinary surgeon. Does he perform an operation? Does the dog recover? This is the intro of the chapter. As I told you, Tricky is the name of pet dog. He belongs to Mrs. Pumphrey. Mrs. Pumphrey is the owner of Tricky. Once he fell seriously ill and he was taken to veterinary surgeon. Who is veterinary surgeon? A doctor of pet. A doctor of animals. Doctor of animals is known as veterinary. So does he perform an operation or how the dog recovered? We are going to see in this chapter. I was really worried about Tricky this time. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in the street with his mistress, and I was shocked at his appearance. Now, who is I? Here, I is doctor. As I told you, this chapter is written by James Harriet. He was a doctor, so he is the speaker in this chapter. The doctor is sharing his experience. So wherever I comes in this chapter, it means the doctor is talking. So here what the doctor is saying that he was very worried. He was very much worried when he saw Tricky. Actually, once he was in his car, he was driving and he saw Tricky with Mrs. Pumphrey and he was shocked to see Tricky. Why he was shocked? Because Tricky had become hugely fat like a bloated sausage with a leg at each corner, his eyes bloodshot and roomy, stared straight ahead and his tongue lolled from his jaws. Now why the doctor was shocked? Because when he saw Tricky had become hugely fat like a bloated sausage. Now what is sausage? Actually sausage is a food which is made of minced meat and it looks like a cylindrical actually it is in a cylindrical shape. Okay, cylindrical shape like this. So the dog was looking like a fat sausage, bloated sausage, and his leg was at each corner and his eyes was actually his eyes were red in color. Bloodshot means red in color and roomy means watery, and his tongue lolled out means it was hanging from his mouth. So here the doctor is describing the personality of the dog, how the dog was looking. He was fat like bloated sausage and his eyes were watery and red in color. His tongue was hanging from his mouth. That is why he was shocked. Mrs. Pumphrey hastened to explain he was so listless, Mr. Harriet. Now, Mrs. Pumphrey, she started to explain what she started to explain about the dog, that he was so listless. Listless means lacking interest. Lacking interest. The dog was lacking interest. He seemed to have no energy. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. Malnutrition means lack of nutrition. Lack of nutrition in the body. So I have been giving him some little extra meals to build him up. Some malt, cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much really. So what Mrs. Pumphrey started to explain, she started saying that I thought my dog is suffering from malnutrition. He lacks energy. So I started giving him extra meals. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner was already given to Tricky, but apart from that, she also started giving some malt, cod liver oil, and bowl of Horlicks to give nutrition to Tricky. Okay. Then, and did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you? Now the doctor is asking, I said you not to give him sweets. So, are you giving him or not? Oh, I did, but I did it for a while, but he seemed to be so weak, I had to relent. He does love cream cakes and chocolates, so I can't bear to refuse him. So when the doctor asked that, are you giving him sweets or have you cut down it? So she said that for a bit I did not give, for a while I did not give him sweets, but later on I had to give because he loves to eat cream cakes and chocolates, so I can't refuse my dog. I have to give. I looked down again at the little dog. That was the trouble. Tricky's only fault was greed. He had never been known to refuse food. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night. And I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pumphrey hadn't mentioned. So now the doctor understood what was the trouble with Tricky. The only mistake was Tricky was very greed. Greed means very a foodie type. Okay, he was very foodie. He always wanted to eat whatever Mrs. Pumphrey used to give Tricky. He used to eat it. He never refused to eat. So that is the reason why he spoiled his health. So what were the things that he was eating? He used to have his breakfast, lunch, dinner. Apart from that, extra meals he was having like some malt, cod liver oil, and Horlicks, and cream cakes, chocolates. So a lot of things he was eating. So that is the reason why he spoiled his health. Are you giving him plenty of exercise? Now the doctor is asking Mrs. Pumphrey that are you giving him plenty of exercise? Well, he has little walks with me as you can see, but Hodkin, the gardener, has been down with lumbago, so there has been nothing throwing lately. So what she replies that yeah, I give him little walks. Means Tricky takes some walk with me, but my gardener, what is the name of gardener? Hodkin. The gardener is not keeping well. He is suffering from lumbago. Now lumbago is a type of muscle pain. Okay, it is a type of muscle pain in back. So my gardener, he is suffering from pain in his back, so he is not active with my dog. So my dog doesn't take too much of walk, only little walk he is taking. You can see in the picture here, Tricky, how fat he is. No, he is looking like a bloated sausage, and he is finding difficult to walk. This is Mrs. Pumphrey, okay, and he is doctor. They are having conversation. I tried to sound severe. Now I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right down and give him more exercise, he is going to be really ill. You must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet. Now the doctor is strictly advising Mrs. Pumphrey that you have to cut down his meals, you have to cut down his sweets. Okay, and you have to give him lot of exercises. If not, Tricky will worsen his health. So you have to hold your heart, you have to make yourself strong, and you have to keep him on a strict diet. You have to stop giving him lot of food. Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands. Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet. I am sure you are right, but it is so difficult, so very difficult. She set off, head down, along the road, as if determined to put the new regime into the practice immediately. So, as soon as the doctor advised her, she became nervous. But she said that okay, I will try my level best. From now onwards, I'm not going to give lot of food to my dog, and I'm going to make a new routine. Regime means new routine. Okay, I'm going to follow a strict diet for my dog. It is difficult for me, but I will do it. I watched their progress with growing concern. Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet days. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. So now Mrs. Pumphrey and dog, they both were going to their home. Tricky was tottering, means walking. Tricky was walking along in his little tweed coat. Tweed coat means woolen coat. Okay, woolen coat. He had a whole wardrobe. Wardrobe means cupboard, cupboard or closet, whatever you can say. So Tricky had a cupboard, and he had lot of dress with him, like raincoat for rainy days and woolen clothes for winter days. Okay, he struggled on, drooping in his harness. Drooping means reducing. Harness means it is a belt. Actually, it is a belt which is tied around the neck of animal, pet animal. That is harness. So, because Tricky was overweight, and he was not feeling well, so he was finding difficult to walk in his harness. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. So now doctor understood that Tricky is not well, and anytime I may get call from Mrs. Pumphrey about the bad condition of Tricky. The expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. So the doctor already expected that any time Mrs. Pumphrey may call me, and his expectation turned into reality. He he got a call from Mrs. Pumphrey within few days. Within a few days, Mrs. Pumphrey called doctor, and she was very much worried. Distraught means worried about the health of Tricky. Tricky would eat nothing, refused even his favorite dishes, and besides he had bouts of vomiting. He spent all his time lying on a rug, panting, didn't want to go for walks, didn't want to do anything. Now, what she is telling to the doctor that Tricky, Tricky's health has worsened. He is not eating anything. He has refused to eat even his favorite dishes. And besides that, he is having repeated vomits. Bouts means again and again, repeated vomits he is having. He spent all his time lying on a rug. Rug means it is a mat on which Tricky used to sit and rest. Panting means finding difficulty in breathing. Didn't want to go for walks. So now Tricky's health has deteriorated. Now he is not eating anything, not even his favorite dishes, and he is vomiting. Repeated vomits he is having, and he is just lying on his rug and panting. Okay, so now the condition has worsened. I had made my plans in advance. Who is saying this? The doctor. The doctor had already made plans in his mind. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. Now, what was the plan? What was his plan? That anyhow I have to bring that Tricky to my place. I have to take Tricky out from Mrs. Pumphrey's house. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight to be kept under observation. What he suggested to Mrs. Pumphrey, that Tricky needs to be admitted in hospital for about 15 days. Fortnight means 15 days, a period of 2 weeks, and I have to observe him carefully. The poor lady almost swooned. Swooned means she fainted. After listening to the news, she fainted. She was sure he would pine and die if he did not see her every day. What she thought, that Tricky cannot live without me. He will be upset. Pine means upset, and he will die if he did not see me every day. But I took a firm line. Who took a firm line? The doctor took a firm decision, a strong decision. What decision he took? That he is going to take Tricky to the hospital. Tricky was very ill, and this was the only way to save him. In fact, I thought it best to take him without delay, and followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailing. So the doctor, he made a strong decision that no matter what, I am going to take Tricky along with me, because that change has to be made. I marched out to the car carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. So how he took Tricky? By wrapping him in a blanket. The entire staff was roused, and maids rushed in and out, bringing his day beds, his night bed, favorite cushions, toys, rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. So, when the doctor took Tricky and he was moving towards his car, the entire staff came out. Entire staff means the servants, maids that were in Mrs. Pumphrey's house. They all came out bringing the Tricky's belongings, like his night bed, his day bed, his cushions, his toys, whatever belongings Tricky had. They all brought those things, and they kept in the car. They started to keep inside the car. Realizing that my car would never hold all the stuff, I started to drive away. Now the doctor realized that all these stuffs are not going to fit in my car, so he started to drive his car. As I moved off, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, threw an armful of the little coats through the window. So when he started to move his car, Mrs. Pumphrey, she came crying, and she throwed some of the coats of Tricky through the window. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. So when the doctor was about to take turn, he looked in the mirror and he saw that everybody was in tears, means everybody was crying, like entire staff and Mrs. Pumphrey. Why they were crying? Because they did not want the doctor to take Tricky to the hospital, so they were crying. Out on the road, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal gasping on the seat by my side. So when he was moving, or when he was driving the car, the doctor, he just looked at the Tricky who was sitting next to him. I patted the head, and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. Because he was a doctor, he knew how to comfort animals. So he patted the head of Tricky, and Tricky also showed some love by wagging his tail, means by moving his tail. He showed his happiness. Poor old lad, I said, you haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. The doctor, he said to Tricky that I know you have no energy within you. You are so weak now. You are not feeling well, but I know what is cure. What is the cure for you? At the surgery, the household dogs surged round me. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes, and when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. So now at the surgery means at the clinic or at the hospital. Okay. So now the doctor reached his clinic. The household dogs means some dogs were already there in his clinic. They surrounded the doctor. Surged means surrounded. They surrounded him. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack. Noisy pack means the group of dogs. Okay, the group of dogs who were there at the clinic. He looked with dull eyes, and when Tricky was kept down on the carpet, the other dogs, they came and started to sniff him, means to smell him for a few seconds. But Tricky, he did not show any interest. He was an uninteresting object and ignored him. Tricky because he was not keeping well. How will he talk with other dogs, or how will he play with other dogs? So he was showing no interest actually. Other dogs, they came, they surrounded Tricky, they were smelling him, but they realized that this dog is uninteresting object. Then they ignored and went away. I made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. So now the doctor, he arranged the bed of Tricky in a warm, loose box next to the other dogs. For 2 days, I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. So what did the doctor do? For the first 2 days, he did not give anything to eat. What he gave, he just gave plenty of water and no food. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. So, for 2 days, the doctor did not give anything to eat, only he gave plenty of water. At the end of second day, he started to show some interest. That means little improvement was seen in the health of Tricky. He started to show some interest in his surroundings, means with other dogs. He started to show some interest with other dogs, and on third day he began to whimper, means to make noise. Whimper means to make noise. Usually when dogs cry, they make some slow noise, they make, that is whimper. So on third day he started to whimper when he heard the other dogs in the yard. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe, the greyhound, and his friends. Then on then the doctor, he opened the door, and what he saw Tricky walking. He saw Tricky walking out and immediately engulfed by Joe, means he was friendly with Joe. Who is Joe? He is also a dog, and he belonged to the breed of greyhound. Greyhound is also a breed of animal dog. Okay, so he became friend of Joe, and he also started playing with other friends. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. Surplus fat means more fat. Okay, so now Tricky started to show interest in his surrounding with his fellow dogs, and he also started to mingle with them. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. Feeding time means lunch time or dinner time. Okay, feeding time is that. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. Okay, so later on that day, the doctor was present at the feeding time, at the lunch time, and what he saw that Tristan is assistant, you can say. He was an assistant who used to take care of the dogs, who used to give timely food to them, like on time he used to give them lunch or dinner. So he was a caretaker, you can say. Tristan was a caretaker. He used to put foods in the bowls of every dog. Slopped means putting. So he was putting food into the bowls. There was the usual headlong rush, followed by the sounds of high speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. So when the assistant or when the caretaker, he was putting food into the bowls, every dog knew that it is my responsibility to finish my food. If I'm not going to eat, I will be hungry. No one is going to come and spoon feed me. So they knew that it's my duty to go and eat by myself. See. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shiny bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Okay, so when the other dogs, they had finished their food, Tricky came walking slowly and he started to lick the emptied bowls. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. So, when Tricky showed interest in eating by licking the bowls of other dog, the doctor, from next day, he started giving Tricky an extra bowl, means he started to give him food, and he was very happy to see that how Tricky is showing interest in eating. From then on, his progress was rapid. So from then onwards, his improvement. Actually, he started showing improvement. His improvement was rapid, very fast. He had no medicinal treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. Okay, so the doctor, he did not give any medicines to Tricky. What he gave, he just gave plenty of water, and he did not give food. Then from third day onwards, he started to give food. And Tricky, he joined in their friendly scrimmages. Okay, so Tricky, he started showing interest in his fellow dogs. He started to mingle with other dogs. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, tramped on, and squashed every few minutes. So now he started playing with other dogs, okay, jumping, falling, then again standing, then whatever games the dogs play, even he started doing that. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely silky little object among the shaggy crew, fighting like a tiger for his share at meal times and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. He had never had such a time in his life. So now Tricky, he became an accepted member, means now he was accepted by the other dogs. Okay, now he was showing interest, he was playing with other dogs, so he became friends. So he became friend of other dogs. And he was also brave. He used to fight for his food. And this type of lifestyle he did not get in the house of Mrs. Pumphrey. When he was with Mrs. Pumphrey, he was having a sedentary life, a very different type of life he was having. But here he is having a different type of life. Here he is having activity, he is playing with other dogs, and he is not getting too much of food. So his health is improving here. Okay. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletin. So now these days, what Mrs. Pumphrey is doing, now these days, Mrs. Pumphrey, she is very anxious. She is worried to know what my Tricky is doing in hospital. So she is calling again and again in the clinic to get the news about her dog. I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather, but I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. So the doctor, he used to ignore the questions. He used to dodge the questions of Mrs. Pumphrey, because useless questions she was asking, whether my dog is he's wearing the right coat or not. Means simple questions or silly questions she was asking. So he used to ignore those questions, but he was having one good news to tell Mrs. Pumphrey, that your dog is out of danger and he is recovering rapidly. Convalescing means recovering. His health is improving. The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. Okay, so when she heard that my dog is recovering, she was not much satisfied with that. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. Now again she started to send fresh eggs, 2 dozen. Okay, 1 dozen means 12 eggs. 2 dozen means 24 eggs. So how many eggs she was sending? 2 dozen at a time. Why? To build up Tricky's strength, to give extra strength to Tricky. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. Okay. So when she started to send dozens of egg, uh, actually the doctor did not give any egg to Tricky. Instead, he was eating. Okay, he was eating 2 eggs for breakfast, and he used to give to his colleagues also. So the colleagues and doctor were enjoying the breakfast, and she also sent bottle of wine. Why? To boost the energy of Tricky. It was to enrich Tricky's blood, okay, to give energy to Tricky. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. So now the doctor is saying that because Mrs. Pumphrey used to send dozen of eggs daily and wine, so it was like a ceremonial occasion for us. A good meal. We used to enjoy good meal with two glasses of wine and several during the meal. So they were enjoying. They were not giving to the dog, but instead they were having it. We could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. For a few nights, the fine spirit means brandy, was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. So, uh, what she used to send? Eggs, wine, and now she started sending brandy. Okay, all for Tricky she was sending. But she did not have idea that they are not giving to Tricky, instead they are having it. For a few nights, the brandy and good food was very much, appreciated by them. They were days of deep content, starting well with the extra egg in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously round the fire with the brandy. Now here, the doctor, he is recalling those days when Tricky was admitted, when Tricky was hospitalized, how good those days were, because she used to send a good food, okay? Daily she used to send good foods. We were enjoying eggs, wine, brandy, you know. So the doctor, he is recalling those days. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. Actually, the doctor, he wanted to keep Tricky as a permanent guest, means as a permanent patient. He wanted to keep Tricky for lifelong in the hospital, but he knew that Mrs. Pumphrey, she is worried about Tricky. She want to have Tricky with her. So finally, he was forced to call her and tell that your dog is all fit and fine now. You can come and collect your dog from here. Actually, why the why the doctor wanted to keep Tricky as a permanent guest? Because he was enjoying good meal with brandy, with wine and eggs. So he wanted to keep Tricky as permanent guest. Okay, but he called Mrs. Pumphrey and said that come and collect your dog. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. Okay, so as soon as he called Mrs. Pumphrey, within no time, a 30 feet black metal came outside the clinic. What was that? That was the car. Because she was a wealthy lady, she came in a latest car that was 30 feet long, black metal car, and it came and stood outside the surgery, outside the clinic. The chauffeur opened the door and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey almost lost in the interior. The chauffeur means the driver, the one who drives the car. The driver, he opened the door, and the doctor, he could only see from far that a lady is sitting inside, that is Mrs. Pumphrey is sitting inside, and she is lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. Tremble means shivering or shaking, you can say. Okay, okay, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he really better? So now, what she is asking doctor that how is my Tricky? Where is my Tricky? Is he really in a good condition? Yes, he's fine. There is no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him. The doctor said that you don't have to come out of the car. I'm going to bring your Tricky here. I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricky. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe, hard muzzled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. So the doctor, he went into the garden to bring Tricky, uh, and finally he brought Tricky in his hand. So in 2 weeks, Tricky had transformed into a lithe. Lithe means flexible. He was flexible now. He Okay, his fat was removed. The surplus fat that he had in his body, it was removed. Now he was flexible and hard muscled animal. He was slim. Okay, he was healthy now. He was keeping well with the pack. Pack means other dogs. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. So as soon as the doctor he brought Tricky in his arms, you can see here in the picture the dog. He is so happy to see his owner, right? So as soon as the doctor he brought Tricky in his arm, the Tricky he jumped into the Pumphrey's lap. Why? Because after a long time he is seeing his owner, so he was very much happy to see Mrs. Pumphrey. She gave a startled oh and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. Because he was happy, so he started to show his happiness. He wagged his tail and he started to licking her face. She had to defend herself. Okay. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats, bowls, none of which had been used. Okay, so the doctor and the driver, both of them, they brought all the belongings of the dog, like his coats, his bowls, his cushions, his toys, everything. Uh, they bought and gave it to Mrs. Pumphrey. Actually, that was unused. It was kept unused. Nothing was used in the clinic. As the car moved, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriet," she cried, "how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." So as the car started to move, Mrs. Pumphrey, she peeped out of the window, and her tears started to roll down off her cheeks. Actually, it was the tears of joy. Okay, she was crying out of happiness, and she wanted to thank Doctor Mr. Harriet, but she had no words how to thank. So what she said, this is a triumph of surgery. It means this is the victory of your clinic. Okay, this is the victory of your clinic, that without giving any medicine, without undergoing any operation, my Tricky has recovered, and it is all because of you. You have transformed his life. Actually, he was very unhealthy, but because of you now he is healthy. So she is thanking and she is saying that it is the victory of your clinic. So here we have completed the explanation of the chapter. I hope you like this video, you understood the chapter.